Preface of A Short History of Pittsburgh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. A Short History of Pittsburgh by Harden Church. Section 0. Preface. Some 10 years ago, I contributed to a book on historic towns, published by G. P. Putnam's Sons of New York and London, a brief historical sketch of Pittsburgh. The approach of the 150th anniversary of the founding of Pittsburgh, and the elaborate celebrations planned in connection therewith, led to many requests that I would reprint the sketch in its own covers as a souvenir of the occasion. Finding it quite inadequate for permanent preservation in its original form, I have, after much research and painstaking labor, rewritten the entire work, adding many new materials, and making of it what I believe to be a complete, though a short, history of our city. The story has developed itself into 3 natural divisions: historical, industrial, and intellectual, and the record will show that under either one of these titles, Pittsburgh is a notable, and under all of them, an imperial city. SHC, Lake Placid Club, Adirondack Mountains, August 25th, 1908. End of Section 0. Preface. Section 1 of A Short History of Pittsburgh by Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 1. Historical, Chapter 1. George Washington, the father of his country, is equally the father of Pittsburgh, for he came thither in November 1753 and established the location of the now imperial city by choosing it as the best place for a fort. Washington was then 21 years old. He had by that time written his precocious 110 maxims of civility and good behavior, had declined to be a midshipman in the British Navy, had made his only sea voyage to Barbados, had surveyed the estates of Lord Fairfax, going for months into the forest without fear of savage Indians or wild beasts, and was now a major of the Virginia militia. In pursuance of the claim of Virginia that she owned that part of Pennsylvania in which Pittsburgh is situated, Washington came there as the agent of Governor Dinwiddie to treat with the Indians. With an eye alert for the dangers of the wilderness, and with Christopher Gist beside him, the young Virginian pushed his cautious way to the point of land where the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers forms the Ohio. That, he declared, with clear military instinct, was the best site for a fort, and he rejected the promontory 2 miles below, which the Indians had recommended for that purpose. Washington made 6 visits to the vicinity of Pittsburgh, all before his presidency, and on 3 of them, 1753, 1758, and 1770, he entered the limits of the present city. At the time of dispatching the army to suppress the whiskey insurrection, while he was president in 1794, he came toward Pittsburgh as far as Bedford, and then, after planning the march, returned to Philadelphia. His contact with the place was, therefore, frequent, and his information always very complete. There is a tradition, none the less popular because it cannot be proved, which ascribes to Washington the credit of having suggested the name of Pittsburgh to General Forbes when the place was captured from the French. However this may be, we do know that Washington was certainly present when the English flag was hoisted and the city named Pittsburgh on Sunday, November 26, 1758. And at that moment Pittsburgh became a chief bulwark of the British Empire in America. End of Section 1. Section 2 of A Short History of Pittsburgh by Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 2. Historical, Chapter 2. As early as 1728, a daring hunter or trader found the Indians at the headwaters of the Ohio, among them the Delawares, Shawnees, Mohicans, and Iroquois, whither they tracked the bear from their village of Logstown, 17 miles down the river. They also employed the country roundabout as a highway for their march to battle against other tribes, and against each other. At that time France and England were disputing for the new continent. France, by right of her discovery of the Mississippi, claimed all lands drained by that river and its tributaries, a contention which would naturally plant her banner upon the summit of the Allegheny Mountains. England, on the other hand, claimed everything from ocean shore to ocean shore. This situation produced war, and Pittsburgh became the strategic key of the great Middle West. The French made early endeavors to win the allegiance of the Indians, and felt encouraged to press their friendly overtures because they usually came among the red men for trading or exploration, while the English invariably seized and occupied their lands. In 1731, some French settlers did attempt to build a group of houses at Pittsburgh, but the Indians compelled them to go away. The next year, the governor of Pennsylvania summoned 2 Indian chiefs from Pittsburgh to say why they had been going to see the French governor at Montreal, and they gave answer that he had sent for them only to express the hope that both English and French traders might meet at Pittsburgh and carry on trade amicably. The governor of Pennsylvania sought to induce the tribes to draw themselves farther east, where they might be made to feel the hand of authority, but Sassunin, their chief, forbade them to stir. An Iroquois chief who joined his entreaties to those of the governor was soon afterward killed by some Shawanese braves, but they were forced to flee into Virginia to escape the vengeance of his tribe. Louis Céloron, a French officer, made an exploration of the country contiguous to Pittsburgh in 1747, and formally enjoined the governor of Pennsylvania not to occupy the ground, as France claimed its sovereignty. A year later, the Ohio Company was formed, with a charter ceding an immense tract of land for sale and development, including Pittsburgh. This corporation built some storehouses at Logstown to facilitate their trade with the Indians, which were captured by the French, together with skins and commodities valued at 20,000 francs, and the purposes of the company were never accomplished. End of Section 2. Section 3 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 3. Historical, Chapter 3. Washington's first visit to Pittsburgh occurred in November 1753, while he was on his way to the French fort at Leboeuf. He was carrying a letter from the Ohio Company to Contrecoeur, protesting against the plans of the French commander and undertaking to establish a line of forts to reach from Lake Erie to the mouth of the Ohio River. The winter season was becoming very severe, in despite of which, Washington and Gist were forced to swim with their horses across the Allegheny River. On the way, they fell in with a friendly Indian, Kiashuta, a Seneca chief, who showed them much kindness, and for whom a suburban town, Giasuda, is named. Washington, in writing of his first sight of the forks of the river, says, "As I got down before the canoe, I spent some time in viewing the rivers and the land at the fork, which I think extremely well situated for a fort, as it has the absolute command of both rivers. The land at the point is 25 feet above the common surface of the water, and a considerable bottom of flat, well-timbered land all around it, very convenient for building. The rivers are each 1/4 mile across, and run here very nearly at right angles, the Allegheny being northeast, and the Monongahela southeast. The former of these two is a very rapid and swift-running water, the other deep and still without any perceptible fall. About 2 miles from this on the southeast side of the river, at a place where the Ohio Company intended to erect a fort, lives Shingus, king of the Delawares. We called upon him to invite him to a council at Logstown. As I had taken a good deal of notice yesterday at the fork, my curiosity led me to examine this more particularly, and I think it greatly inferior either for defense or advantages, especially the latter. For a fort at the fork would be equally well situated on the Ohio, and have the entire command of the Monongahela, which runs up our settlement, and is extremely well designed for water carriage, as it is of a deep, still nature. Besides, a fort at the fork might be built at much less expense than at the other place. Leaving Pittsburgh, Washington and Gist proceeded in a northeasterly direction, and after a day's journey they came upon an Indian settlement, and were constrained by the tribe to remain there for 3 days. A group of these Indians accompanied the 2 travelers to the French fort, and on the journey a large number of bear and deer were killed. At Leboeuf, Washington received from the French commander a very satisfactory reply. On the trip back, the 2 pioneers encountered almost insupportable hardships. Lacking proper food, their horses died, so that they were forced to push forward in canoes, often finding it necessary, when the creeks were frozen, to carry their craft for long stretches overland. When Venango was reached, Washington, whose clothes were now in tatters, procured an Indian costume, and he and Gist continued their way on foot, accompanied by an Indian guide. At this point, an illustrious career was put in deadly peril, for on the second day of his escort, the treacherous guide deliberately fired his gun at Washington when standing only a few feet away from him. Bad marksmanship saved the intended victim, and Gist started to kill the Indian on the spot. But Washington, patient then as always, sent the savage away, giving him provisions to last until he could reach his tribe. But an apprehension of further trouble from the friends of the discomfited guide impelled the two men to travel all that night and the next day, although Washington was suffering acute agony from his frosted feet. While recrossing the Allegheny River on a rude raft, Washington fell into the icy waters and was saved by Gist from drowning only after the greatest efforts had been employed to rescue him. Reaching Her's Island, within the present city limits, they built a fire and camped there for the night, but in the morning Gist's hands were frozen. The bitter cold had now solidified the river, and the two wanderers passed over it on foot. By noon they had reached the home of John Fraser at Turtle Creek, where they were given clothes and fresh supplies. The journey was completed in 3 more days, and on receiving the reply of Contrecoeur, the English began their preparations for sending troops to Pittsburgh. End of section 3. Section 4 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 4. Historical, Chapter 4. As soon as Washington's advice as to the location of the fort was received, Captain William Trent was dispatched to Pittsburgh with a force of soldiers and workmen, pack horses, and materials, and he began in all haste to erect a stronghold. The French had already built forts on the northern lakes, and they now sent Captain Contrecoeur down the Allegheny with 1,000 French, Canadians, and Indians, and 18 pieces of cannon, in a flotilla of 60 bateaux and 300 canoes. Trent had planted himself in Pittsburgh on February 17, 1754, a date important because it marks the first permanent white settlement there. But his work had been retarded alike by the small number of his men and the severity of the winter, and when Contrecoeur arrived in April, the young subaltern who commanded in Trent's absence surrendered the unfinished works, and was permitted to march away with his 33 men. The French completed the fort and named it Duquesne in honor of the governor of Canada, and they held possession of it for 4 years. Immediately on the loss of this fort, Virginia sent a force under Washington to retake it. Washington surprised a French detachment near Great Meadows and killed their commander, Jumonville. When a larger expedition came against him, he put up a stockade near the site of Uniontown, naming it Fort Necessity, which he was compelled to yield on terms permitting him to march away with the honors of war. End of section 4. Section 5 of A Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 5. Historical, Chapter 5. The next year, 1755, General Edward Braddock came over with 2 regiments of British soldiers, and after augmenting his force with colonial troops and a few Indians, began his fatal march upon Fort Duquesne. Braddock's testy disposition, his consuming egotism, his contempt for the colonial soldiers, and his stubborn adherence to military maxims that were inapplicable to the warfare of the wilderness, alienated the respect and confidence of the American contingent, robbed him of an easy victory, and cost him his life. Benjamin Franklin had warned him against the imminent risk of Indian ambuscades, but he had contemptuously replied, "These savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the King's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible they should make any impression." Some of his English staff officers urged him to send the Rangers in advance and to deploy his Indians as scouts, but he rejected their prudent suggestions with a sneer. On July 9th, his army, comprising 2,200 soldiers and 150 Indians, was marching down the south bank of the Monongahela. The variant color and fashion of the expedition, the red-coated regulars, the blue-coated Americans, the naval detachment, the Rangers in deerskin shirts and leggings, the savages half naked and befeathered, the glint of sword and gun in the hot daylight, the long wagon train, the lumbering cannon, the drove of bullocks, the royal banner and the colonial gonfalon, the pomp and puissance of it all composed a spectacle of martial splendor unseen in that country before. On the right was the tranquil river, and on the left, the trackless wilderness whence startled deer sprang into deeper solitude. At noon the expedition crossed the river and pressed on toward Fort Duquesne, 8 miles below, expectant of victory. What need to send out scouts when the king's troops are here? Let young George Washington and the rest urge it all they may. The thing is beneath the dignity of His Majesty's general. Meanwhile, all was not tranquil at the French fort. Surrender was talked of, but Captain Beaujeu determined to lead a force out to meet the approaching army. Taking with him a total of 36 officers and cadets, 72 regular soldiers, 146 Canadians, and about 600 Indian warriors, a command less than half the number of the enemy, he sallied out to meet him. How insignificant were the armed forces with which the two empires were now challenging each other for the splendid prize of a new world. Beaujeu, gaily clad in a fringed hunting dress, intrepidly pressed on until he came in sight of the English invaders. As soon as the alert French commander felt the hot breath of his foe, he waved his hat and his faithful followers disappeared behind rocks and trees as if the very earth had swallowed them. The unsuspecting English came on. But here, when they have crossed, is a level plain, elevated but a few feet above the surface of the river, extending nearly half a mile landwards, and then gradually ascending into thickly wooded hills, with Fort Duquesne beyond. The troops in front had crossed the plain and plunged into the road through the forest for 100 feet, when a heavy discharge of musketry and arrows was poured upon them, which wrought in them a consternation all the greater, because they could see no foe anywhere. They shot at random, and not without effect, for when Beaujeu fell, the Canadians began to flee, and the Indians quailed in their covers before the cannon fire of the English. But the French fighters were rallied back to their hidden recesses, and they now kept up an incessant and destructive fire. In this distressing situation, the English fell back into the plain. Braddock rode in among them, and he and his officers persistently endeavored to rally them, but without success. The colonial troops adopted the Indian method, and each man fought for himself behind a tree. This was forbidden by Braddock, who attempted to form his men in platoons and columns, making their slaughter inevitable. The French and Indians, concealed in the ravines and behind trees, kept up a cruel and deadly fire, until the British soldiers lost all presence of mind and began to shoot each other and their own officers, and hundreds were thus slain. The Virginia companies charged gallantly up a hill with a loss of but 3 men, but when they reached the summit, the British soldiery, mistaking them for the enemy, fired upon them, killing 50 out of 80 men. The colonial troops then resumed the Indian fashion of fighting from behind trees, which provoked Braddock, who had had 5 horses killed under him in 3 hours, to storm at them and strike them with his sword. At this moment he was fatally wounded, and many of his men now fled away from the hopeless action, not waiting to hear their general's fainting order to retreat. Washington had had 2 horses killed and received 3 bullets through his coat. Being the only mounted officer who was not disabled, he drew up the troops still on the field, directed their retreat, maintaining himself at the rear with great coolness and courage, and brought away his wounded general. 64 British and American officers and nearly 1,000 privates were killed or wounded in this battle, while the total French and Indian loss was not over 60. A few prisoners captured by the Indians were brought to Pittsburgh and burnt at the stake. 4 days after the fight, Braddock died, exclaiming to the last, "Who would have thought it?" End of section 5. Section 6 of A Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 6. Historical, Chapter 6. Despondency seized the English settlers after Braddock's defeat, but 2 years afterward William Pitt became Prime Minister, and he thrilled the nation with his appeal to protect the colonies against France and the savages. William Pitt, the great Earl of Chatham, the man for whom our city is named, was one of the most indomitable characters in the statesmanship of modern times. Born in November 1708, he was educated at Eton and at Oxford, and then traveled in France and Italy, and was elected to Parliament when 27 years old. His early addresses were not models either of force or logic, but the fluent speech and many personal attractions of the young orator instantly caught the attention of the people, who always listened to him with favor, and it was not long before his constant participation in public affairs developed the splendid talents which he possessed. Wayward and affected in little things, Pitt attacked the great problems of government with the bold confidence of a master spirit, impressing the clear genius of his leadership upon the yearning heart of England in every emergency of peace or war. Too great to be consistent, he never hesitated to change his tactics or his opinion when the occasion developed the utility of another course. Ordinary men have been more faithful to asserted principles, but no statesman more frequently departed from asserted principles to secure achievements which resounded the honor of the nation. During the 30 years in which Pitt exercised the magic spell of his eloquence and power over English Parliament, the stakes for which he contended against the world were no less than the dominion of North America and of India. In the pursuit of these policies, he fought Spain and subdued her armies. He subsidized the King of Prussia to his interests. He destroyed the navy of France and wrested from her the larger part of her possessions beyond the sea. Having always a clear conception of the remotest aim of national aspiration, he was content to leave the designing of operations in detail to the humbler servants of the government, reserving to himself the mighty concentration of his powers upon the general purpose for which the nation was striving. The king trusted him, the commons obeyed him, the people adored him and called him the great commoner. He was wise, brave, sincere, tolerant, and humane, and no man could more deserve the honor of having named for him a city which was destined to become rich and famous, keeping his memory in more enduring fame than bronze or marble. End of section 6. Section 7 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 7. Historical, Chapter 7. Pitt's letters inspired the Americans with new hope, and he promised to send them British troops and to supply their own militia with arms, ammunition, tents, and provisions at the king's charge. He sent 12,000 soldiers from England, which were joined to a colonial force aggregating 50,000 men, the most formidable army yet seen in the New World. The plan of campaign embraced 3 expeditions, the first against Louisbourg in the Isle of Cape Breton, which was successful, the second against Ticonderoga, which succeeded after a defeat, and the third against Fort Duquesne. General Forbes, born at Dunfermline, whence have come others to Pittsburgh, commanded this expedition, comprising about 7,000 men. The militia from Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland was led by Washington, whose independent spirit led the testy Scotchman, made irritable by a malady which was soon to cause his death, to declare that Washington's behavior about the roads was no ways like a soldier. But we cannot believe that the young Virginian was moved by any motive but the public good. On September 12, 1758, Major Grant, a Highlander, led an advance guard of 850 men to a point 1 mile from the fort, which is still called Grant's Hill, on which the courthouse now stands, where he rashly permitted himself to be surrounded and attacked by the French and Indians, half his force being killed or wounded, and himself slain. Washington followed soon after, and opened a road for the advance of the main body under Forbes. Fort Frontenac, on Lake Ontario, had just been taken by General Amherst, with the result that supplies for Fort Duquesne were cut off. When, therefore, Captain Lignery, the French commandant, learned of the advance of a superior force, having no hope of reinforcements, he blew up the fort, set fire to the adjacent buildings, and drew his garrison away. On Saturday, November 25th, 1758, amidst a fierce snowstorm, the English took possession of the place, and Colonel Armstrong, in the presence of Forbes and Washington, hauled up the puissant banner of Great Britain, while cannons boomed and the exulting victors cheered. On the next day, General Forbes wrote to Governor Denny from Fort Duquesne, now Pittsburgh, the 26th of November, 1758, and this was the first use of that name. On this same Sunday, the Reverend Mr. Beatty, a Presbyterian chaplain, preached a sermon in thanksgiving for the superiority of British arms, the first Protestant service in Pittsburgh. The French had had a Roman Catholic chaplain, Father Barron, during their occupancy. On the next day, Forbes wrote to Pitt with a vision of prophecy as follows. Pittsburgh, 27th November, 1758. Sir, I do myself the honor of acquainting you that it has pleased God to crown His Majesty's arms with success over all his enemies upon the Ohio, by my having obliged the enemy to burn and abandon Fort Duquesne, which they effectuated on the 25th, and of which I took possession the next day, the enemy having made their escape down the river towards the Mississippi in their boats, being abandoned by the Indians, whom I had previously engaged to leave them, and who now seem all willing and ready to implore his Majesty's most gracious protection. So give me leave to congratulate you upon this great event, of having totally expelled the French from this prodigious tract of country, and of having reconciled the various tribes of Indians inhabiting it to his Majesty's government. I have used the freedom of giving your name to Fort Duquesne, as I hope it was in some measure the being actuated by your spirits that now makes us masters of the place. These dreary deserts will soon be the richest and most fertile of any possessed by the British in North America. I have the honor to be with great regard and esteem, sir, your most obedient and most humble servant, John Forbes. End of section 7. Section 8 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 8, Historical, Chapter 8. As a place of urgent shelter, the English proceeded to build a new fort, about 200 yards from the site of Fort Duquesne, which is traditionally known as the first Fort Pitt, and was probably so called by the garrison, although the letters written from there during the next few months refer to it as the camp at Pittsburgh. This stronghold cut off French transportation to the Mississippi by way of the Ohio River, and the only remaining route, by way of the Great Lakes, was soon afterward closed by the fall of Fort Niagara. The fall of Quebec, with the death of the two opposing generals, Montcalm and Wolfe, and the capture of Montreal, ended the claims of France to sovereignty in the New World. The new fort being found too small, General Stanwix built a second Fort Pitt, much larger and stronger, designed for a garrison of 1,000 men. The Indians viewed the newcomers with suspicion, but Colonel Henry Bouquet assured them, with diplomatic tergiversation, that "we have not come here to take possession of your country in a hostile manner, as the French did when they came among you, but to open a large and extensive trade with you and all other nations of Indians to the westward." A redoubt, the blockhouse, built by Colonel Bouquet in 1764, still stands, in a very good state of preservation, being cared for by the daughters of the American Revolution. The protection of the garrison naturally attracted a few traders, merchants, and pioneers to Pittsburgh, and a permanent population began to grow. But the indigenous race continued to resent the extension of white encroachment, and they formed a secret confederacy under Pontiac, the renowned Ottawa chief, who planned a simultaneous attack on all the white frontier posts. This uprising was attended by atrocious cruelties at many of the points attacked, but we may take note here of the movement only as it affected Pittsburgh. At the Grand Council held by the tribes, a bundle of sticks had been given to every tribe, each bundle containing as many sticks as there were days intervening before the deadly assault should begin. One stick was to be drawn from the bundle every day until but one remained, which was to signal the outbreak for that day. This was the best calendar the barbarian mind could devise. At Pittsburgh, a Delaware squaw who was friendly to the whites had stealthily taken out 3 of the sticks, thus precipitating the attack on Fort Pitt 3 days in advance of the time appointed. The last stick was reached on June 22, 1763, and the Delawares and Shawnees began the assault in the afternoon under Simon Ecuyer. The people of Pittsburgh took shelter in the fort, and held out while waiting for reinforcements. Colonel Bouquet hurried forward a force of 500 men, but they were intercepted at Bushy Run, where a bloody battle was fought. Bouquet had 50 men killed and 60 wounded, but inflicted a much greater loss on his savage foes, and gained the fort, relieving the siege. As soon as Bouquet could recruit his command, he moved down the Ohio, attacked the Indians, liberated some of their prisoners, and taught the red men to respect the power that controlled Pittsburgh. In 1768, the Indians ceded their lands about Pittsburgh to the colonies, and civilization was then free to spread over them. In 1774, a land office was opened in Pittsburgh by Governor Dunmore, and land warrants were granted on payment of 2 shillings and 6 pence purchase money at the rate of £10 per 100 acres. End of section 8. Section 9 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 9, Historical, Chapter 9. Washington made his last visit to Pittsburgh in October 1770, when, on his way to the Kanawha River, he stopped here for several days and lodged with Samuel Semple, the first innkeeper, whose hostelry stood, and still stands, at the corner of Water and Ferry Streets. This house was later known as the Virginian Hotel, and for many years furnished entertainment to those early travelers. The building, erected in 1764 by Colonel George Morgan, is now nearly 140 years old, and is still devoted to public hospitality, but the character of its patronage has changed from George Washington to the deck roisterers who lodged there between their trips on the river packets. At the time of Washington's visit, the lower story of the house was divided into 3 rooms, 2 facing on Ferry Street, and the third, a large room, on Water Street, and in this latter room was placed, in the year of Washington's stop there, the first billiard table ever brought to Pittsburgh. The mahogany steps from the first to the second floors, which were once the pride of the place, are still in the house. According to Washington's journal, these were in Pittsburgh in 1770 20 houses situated on Water Street, facing the Monongahela River. These were occupied by traders and their families. The population at that time is estimated at 126 men, women, and children, besides a garrison consisting of 2 companies of British troops. In October 1772, Fort Pitt was ordered abandoned. The works about Pittsburgh, from first to last, had cost the British Crown some $300,000, but the salvage on the stone, brick, and iron of the existing redoubts amounted to only $250. The blockhouse was repaired and occupied for a time by Dr. John Connolly, and during the Revolution it was constantly used by our colonial troops. End of Section 9. Section 10 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 10, Historical, Chapter 10. With the French out of the country, and with William Pitt out of office and incapacitated by age, the colonies began to feel the oppression of a British policy which British statesmen and British historians today most bitterly condemn. America's opposition to tyranny found its natural expression in the Battle of Lexington, April 19, 1775. The fires of patriotism leapt through the continent, and the little settlement at Pittsburgh was quickly aflame with the national spirit. On May 16th, a convention was held at Pittsburgh, which resolved that this committee have the highest sense of the spirited behavior of their brethren in New England, and do most cordially approve of their opposing the invaders of American rights and privileges to the utmost extreme, and that each member of this committee, respectively, will animate and encourage their neighborhood to follow the brave example. No foreign soldiers were sent over the mountains to Pittsburgh, but a more merciless foe, who would attack and harass with remorseless cruelty, was impressed into the English service, despite the horrified protests of some of her wisest statesmen. American treaties with the Indians had no force against the allurements of foreign gold, and under this unholy alliance men were burnt at the stake, women were carried away, and cabins were destroyed. With the aim of regaining the friendship of the Indians, Congress appointed commissioners who met the tribes at Pittsburgh, and Colonel George Morgan, Indian agent, writes to John Hancock, November 8, 1776, "I have the happiness to inform you that the cloud that threatened to break over us is likely to disperse. The 6 nations, with the Munsees, Delawares, Shawnees, and Mohicans, who have been assembled here with their principal chiefs and warriors to the number of 644, have given the strongest assurance of their determination to preserve inviolate the peace and neutrality with the United States." These amicable expectations were not realized, and General Edward Hand came to Pittsburgh of next year and planned an expedition against the Indians. Colonel Broadhead took out Hand's expedition in the summer and burned the Indian towns. The depreciation of paper currency, or continental money, had by this time brought the serious burden of high prices upon the people. The traders, who demanded apparently exorbitant rates for their goods, were denounced in public meetings at Pittsburgh as being now commonly known by the disgraceful epithet of speculators, of more malignant natures than the savage Mingoes in the wilderness. This hardship grew in severity until the finances were put upon a more stable basis. In 1781, there was demoralization and mutiny at Fort Pitt, and General William Irvine was put in command. His firm hand soon restored the garrison to obedience. The close of the war with Great Britain in that year was celebrated by General Irvine by the issue of an order at the fort, November 6, 1781, requiring all, as a sailor would say, to splice the main brace. This order read as follows: "The commissioners will issue a gill of whiskey, extraordinary, to the non-commissioned officers and privates upon this joyful occasion." The Penn family had purchased the Pittsburgh region from the Indians in 1768, and they would offer none of it for sale until 1783. Up until this time, they had held the charter to Pennsylvania, but as they had maintained a steadfast allegiance to the mother country, the General Assembly annulled their title, except to allow them to retain the ownership of various manors throughout the state, embracing 500,000 acres. In order to relieve the people of Pittsburgh from going to Greensburg, to the courthouse in their sacred right of suing and being sued, the General Assembly erected Allegheny County out of parts of Westmoreland and Washington counties, September 24, 1788. This county originally comprised, in addition to its present limits, what are now Armstrong, Beaver, Butler, Crawford, Erie, Mercer, Venango, and Warren counties. The act required that the courthouse and jail should be located in Allegheny, just across the river from Pittsburgh, but as there was no protection against Indians there, an amendment established Pittsburgh as the county seat. The first court was held at Fort Pitt, and the next day a ducking stool was erected for the district at the Point in the Three Rivers. In 1785, the dispute between Virginia and Pennsylvania for the possession of Pittsburgh was settled by the award of a joint commission in favor of Pennsylvania. A writer says that in 1786, Pittsburgh contained 36 log houses, 1 stone and 1 frame house, and 5 small stores. Another records that the population is almost entirely Scots and Irish who live in log houses. A third says of these log houses, "Now and then, one had assumed the appearance of neatness and comfort." The first newspaper, the Pittsburgh Gazette, was established July 29, 1786. A mail route to Philadelphia by horseback was adopted in the same year. On September 29, 1787, the legislature granted a charter to the Pittsburgh Academy, a school that has grown steadily in usefulness and power as the Western University of Pennsylvania, and which has, in this year, July 11, 1908, appropriately altered its name to University of Pittsburgh. In 1791, the Indians became vindictive and dangerous, and General Arthur St. Clair, with a force of 2,300 men, was sent down the river to punish them. Neglecting President Washington's imperative injunction to avoid a surprise, he led his command into an ambush and lost half of it in the most disastrous battle with the Redskins since the time of Braddock. In the general alarm that ensued, Fort Pitt being in a state of decay, a new fort was built in Pittsburgh at 9th and 10th Streets and Penn Avenue, a stronghold that included bastions, blockhouses, barracks, etc., and was named Fort Lafayette. General Anthony Wayne was then selected to command another expedition against the savages, and he arrived in Pittsburgh in June 1792. After drilling his troops and making preparations for 2 years, in the course of which he erected several forts in the West, including Fort Defiance and Fort Wayne, he fought the Indians and crushed their strength and spirit. On his return, a lasting peace was made with them, and there were no further raids about Pittsburgh. End of section 10. Section 11 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 11. Historical, Chapter 11. The whiskey insurrection demands a brief reference. Whiskey seems to be a steady concomitant of civilization. As soon as the white settlers had planted themselves securely at Pittsburgh, they made requisition on Philadelphia for 6,000 kegs of flour and 3,000 kegs of whiskey, a disproportion as startling as Falstaff's intolerable deal of sack to 1 halfpenny worth of bread. Congress, in 1791, passed an excise law to assist in paying the war debt. The measure was very unpopular, and its operation was forcibly resisted, particularly in Pittsburgh, which was noted then, as now, for the quantity and quality of its whiskey. There were distilleries on nearly every stream emptying into the Monongahela. The time and circumstances made the tax odious. The Revolutionary War had just closed, the pioneers were in the midst of great Indian troubles, and money was scarce, of low value, and very hard to obtain. The people of the new country were unused to the exercise of stringent laws. The progress of the French Revolution encouraged the settlers to account themselves oppressed by similar tyrannies, against which some of them persuaded themselves similar resistance should be made. Genet, the French demagogue, was sowing sedition everywhere. Lafayette's participation in the French Revolution gave it in America, where he was deservedly beloved, a prestige which it never could have gained for itself. Distillers who paid the tax were assaulted, some of them were tarred and feathered, others were taken into the forest and tied to trees. Their houses and barns were burned, their property was carried away or destroyed. Several thousand insurgents assembled at Braddock's Field and marched on Pittsburgh, where the citizens gave them food and submitted to the Reign of Terror. Then President Washington sent an army of 15,000 troops against them, and they melted away, as a mob will ever do when the strong arm of government smites it without fear or respect. End of section 11. Section 12 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 12. Historical, Chapter 12. It was not long after the close of the Revolutionary War before Pittsburgh was recognized as the natural gateway of the Atlantic seaboard to the west and south, and the necessity for an improved system of transportation became imperative. The earliest method of transportation through the American wilderness required the eastern merchants to forward their goods in Conestoga wagons to Shippensburg and Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and Hagerstown, Maryland, and thence to Pittsburgh on pack horses, where they were exchanged for Pittsburgh products, and these in turn were carried by boat to New Orleans, where they were exchanged for sugar, molasses, and similar commodities, which were carried through the Gulf and along the coast to Baltimore and Philadelphia. For passenger travel, the stagecoach furnished the most luxurious method then known. The people of Pennsylvania had given considerable attention to inland improvements, and as early as 1791, they began to formulate the daring project of constructing a canal system from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, with a portage road over the crest of the Allegheny Mountains. In 1825, the governor appointed commissioners for making surveys, certain residents of Pittsburgh being chosen on the board, and in 1826, February 25th, the legislature passed an act authorizing the commencement of work on the canal at the expense of the state. The western section was completed, and the first boat entered Pittsburgh on November 10, 1829. Subsequent acts provided for the various eastern sections, including the building of the portage railroad over the mountains, and by April 16, 1834, a through line was in operation from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. The termini of the road were Hollidaysburg, 1,398 feet below the mountain summit, and Johnstown, 1,771 feet below the summit. The boats were taken from the water like amphibious monsters and hauled up the 10 inclined planes by stationary engines. The total cost of the canal and portage railroad was about $10 million, and the entire system was sold to the Pennsylvania Railroad Company in 1857, June 25th, for $7,500,000. The importance of canal transportation in the popular mind is shown by the fact that in 1828, when the Pennsylvania legislature granted a charter to the Pennsylvania and Ohio Railroad Company, which never constructed its road, the act stated that the purpose of the railroad was to connect Pittsburgh with the canal at Massillon, Ohio. The railroad quickly superseded the canal, however, and when men perceived that the mountains could be conquered by a portage road, it was a natural step to plan the Pennsylvania and Baltimore and Ohio railroads on a system of easy grades, so that all obstacles of height and distance were annihilated. The Pennsylvania Railroad was incorporated April 13, 1846, and completed its roadway from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh February 15, 1854. The canal was for a time operated by the Pennsylvania Canal Company in the interest of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, but its use was gradually abandoned. The division from Pittsburgh to Johnstown ceased to be operated in 1864, and that portion which was in the Juniata Valley was used until 1899, while the portion lying along the Susquehanna River was operated until 1900. Other railroads came as they were needed. The Baltimore and Ohio received a charter from the state of Maryland on February 28, 1827, but did not reach Pittsburgh until December 12, 1860, when its Pittsburgh and Connellsville branch was opened. The Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad was built into Pittsburgh July 4, 1851, and became part of the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railway in 1856, that line reaching Chicago in 1859. The Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis Railway, the Panhandle, was opened between Pittsburgh and Columbus, Ohio, October 9, 1865. The Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad, now a part of the New York Central lines, was opened into Pittsburgh in February 1879. The Wabash Railway completed its entrance into the city on June 19, 1904. End of Section 12. Section 13 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 13. Historical, Chapter 13. In 1784, the town was laid out, and settlers, among whom were many Scotch and Irish, came rapidly. The town was made the county seat in 1791, incorporated as a borough in 1794, the charter was revived in 1804, and the borough was chartered as a city in 1816. The first charter granted to Pittsburgh in 1816 vested the more important powers of the city government in a common council of 15 members and a select council of 9 members. In 1887, a new charter was adopted, giving to the mayor the power to appoint the heads of departments who were formerly elected by the councils. On March 7, 1901, a new charter, known as the Ripper, was adopted, under the operations of which the elected mayor, William J. Deal, was removed from his office, and a new chief executive officer, A.M. Brown, appointed in his place by the governor, under the title of Recorder. By an act of April 23, 1903, the title of mayor was restored, and under the changes then made, the appointing power rests with the mayor, with the consent of the select council. The following is a list of the mayors of Pittsburgh. 1816 to 1817, Ebenezer Denny. 1817 to 1825, John Darragh. 1825 to 1828, John M. Snowden. 1828 to 1830, Magnus M. Murray. 1830 to 1831, Matthew B. Lowry. 1831 to 1832, Magnus M. Murray. 1832 to 1836, Samuel Pettigrew. 1836 to 1839, Jonas R. McClintock. 1839 to 1840, William Little. 1840 to 1841, William W. Irwin. 1841 to 1842, James Thompson. 1842 to 1845, Alexander Hay. 1845 to 1846, William J. Howard. 1846 to 1847, William Kerr. 1847 to 1849, Gabriel Adams. 1849 to 1850, John Herron. 1850 to 1851, Joseph Baker. 1851 to 1853, John B. Guthrie. 1853 to 1854, Robert M. Riddle. 1854 to 1856, Ferdinand E. Voles. 1856 to 1857, William Bingham. 1857 to 1860, Henry A. Weaver. 1860 to 1862, George Wilson. 1862 to 1864, B. C. Sawyer. 1864 to 1866, James Lowry. 1866 to 1868, W. S. McCarthy. 1868 to 1869, James Blackmore. 1869 to 1872, Jared M. Brush. 1872 to 1875, James Blackmore. 1875 to 1878, William C. McCarthy. 1878 to 1881, Robert Little. 1881 to 1884, Robert W. Lyon. 1884 to 1887, Andrew Fulton. 1887 to 1890, William McCallan. 1890 to 1893, Henry I. Gorley. 1893 to 1896, Bernard McKenna. 1896 to 1899, Henry P. Ford. 1899 to 1901, William J. Deal. 1901, A. M. Brown, title changed to recorder. 1901 to 1903, J. O. Brown, recorder. 1903, W. B. Hayes, recorder, served about 1 week under that title. 1903 to 1906, W. B. Hayes, mayor again. 1906 to 1909, George W. Guthrie. A movement to consolidate the cities of Pittsburgh and Allegheny, together with some adjacent boroughs, was begun in 1853 to 1854. It failed entirely that year, but in 1867, Lawrenceville, Peebles, Collins, Liberty, Pitt, and Oakland, all lying between the two rivers, were annexed to Pittsburgh, and in 1872, there was a further annexation of a district embracing 27 square miles south of the Monongahela River, while in 1906 Allegheny was also annexed, and, as there was litigation to test the validity of the consolidation, the Supreme Court of the United States, on December 6, 1907, declared in favor of the constitutionality of the act. End of section 13. Section 14 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 14, Historical, Chapter 14. The first National Convention of the Republican Party was held in Pittsburgh on February 22nd and 23rd, 1856. While this gathering was an informal convention, it was made for the purpose of effecting a national organization of the groups of Republicans which had grown up in the states where slavery was prohibited. Pittsburgh was, therefore, in a broad sense, the place where the birth of the Republican Party occurred. A digression on this subject, in order that the record may be made clear, will probably not be unwelcome. In 1620, 3 months before the landing of the Mayflower at Provincetown, a Dutch vessel carried African slaves up the James River, and on the soil of Virginia there was a planted system of servitude which at last extended throughout the colonies, and flourished with increasing vigor in the South, until, in the War of the Rebellion, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation put an end forever to slavery in America. When the builders of our government met in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, slavery was a problem which more than once threatened to wreck the scheme for an indissoluble union of the states. But it was compromised under a suggestion implied in the Constitution itself that slavery should not be checked in the states in which it existed until 1808. In the meantime, the entire labor system of the South was built upon African slavery, while in the North, the horror of the public conscience grew against the degrading institution from year to year. By 1854, the men in the free states who were opposed to slavery had begun to unite themselves by political bonds, and in the spring and summer of that year, groups of such men met in more or less informal conferences in Wisconsin, Michigan, New York, Maine, Massachusetts, Iowa, Ohio, and other northern states. But it was at Jackson, Michigan, where the men who were uniting their political fortunes to accomplish the destruction of slavery first assembled in a formal convention on July 6, 1854, nominated a full state ticket, and adopted a platform containing these declarations. Resolved, that, postponing and suspending all differences with regard to political economy or administrative policy, in view of the imminent danger that Kansas and Nebraska will be grasped by slavery, and 1,000 miles of slave soil thus be interposed between the free states of the Atlantic and those of the Pacific, we will act cordially and faithfully in unison to avert and repeal this gigantic wrong and shame. Resolved, that in view of the necessity of battling for the first principles of republican government, and against the schemes of aristocracy, the most revolting and oppressive with which the earth was ever cursed or man debased, we will cooperate and be known as Republicans until the contest be terminated. On January 17, 1856, the Republican Association of Washington, D.C., referring to the extension of slavery into Kansas and Nebraska as the deep dishonor inflicted upon the age in which we live, issued a call, in accordance with what appeared to be the general desire of the Republican Party, inviting the Republicans of the Union to meet an informal convention at Pittsburgh on February 22, 1856, for the purpose of perfecting the national organization and providing for a national delegate convention of the Republican Party at some subsequent day to nominate candidates for the presidency and vice presidency to be supported at the election in November 1856. The Republican Party met accordingly for the first time in a national convention in Pittsburgh on the date appointed, and was largely attended. Not only were all the free states represented, but there were also delegates from Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Missouri. John A. King was made temporary chairman, and Francis P. Blair permanent chairman. Speeches were made by Horace Greeley, Giddings and Gibson of Ohio, Cotting and Lovejoy of Illinois, and others. Mr. Greeley sent a telegraphic report of the first day's proceedings to the New York Tribune, stating that the convention had accomplished much to cement former political differences and distinctions, and that the meeting in Pittsburgh had marked the inauguration of a national party, based upon the principle of freedom. He said that the gathering was very large and the enthusiasm unbounded, that men were acting in the most perfect harmony and with a unity of feeling seldom known to political assemblages of such magnitude, that the body was eminently Republican in principle and tendency, and that it combined much of character and talent, with integrity of purpose and devotion to the great principles which underlie our government. He prophesied that the moral and political effect of this convention upon the country would be felt for the next quarter of a century. In its deliberations, he said that everything had been conducted with marked propriety and dignity. The platform adopted at Pittsburgh demanded the repeal of all laws allowing the introduction of slavery into free territories, promised support by all lawful measures to the free state men in Kansas in their resistance to the usurped authority of lawless invaders, and strongly urged the Republican Party to resist and overthrow the existing national administration because it was identified with the progress of the slave power to national supremacy. On the evening of the second day, a mass meeting was held in aid of the emigration to Kansas. The president of the meeting was George N. Jackson, and D.D. Eaton was made secretary. Horace Greeley and others made addresses, and with great enthusiasm, promises of aid to the bleeding young sister in the West were made. The record seems to show beyond question that the Republican Party had its national birth at Pittsburgh on February 22, 1856, and that it came into being dedicated, as Horace Greeley described it at that moment, to the principle of human freedom. A later formal convention, as provided for at Pittsburgh, was held at Philadelphia on June 17, 1856, which nominated John C. Fremont of California for president, and William L. Dayton of New Jersey for vice president. This ticket polled a total popular vote of 1,341,264, but was beaten by the Democratic candidates, James Buchanan of Pennsylvania for president, and John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky for vice president, who polled 1,838,169 votes. This defeat of a good cause was probably a fortunate piece of adversity, for the men who opposed slavery were not yet strong enough to grapple the monster to its death as they did when Lincoln was nominated 4 years later. It was the high mission of the party in 1856 and 1860 to stand against the extension of slavery, and in 1864 against all slavery, as well as against the destruction of this union, and in 1868 against those who wished to nullify the results of the war. Its later mission has been full of usefulness and honor. End of section 14. Section 15 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 15. Historical, Chapter 15. Among the eminent men who visited Pittsburgh in bygone days, we find record of the following: 1817, President Monroe; 1825, General Lafayette; 1833, Daniel Webster; 1842, Charles Dickens; 1848, Henry Clay; 1849, President Taylor and Governor Johnston; 1852, Lewis Kossuth; 1860, Prince of Wales, now King Edward VII; 1861, President Lincoln; 1866, President Johnson, Admiral Farragut, General Grant, and Secretaries Seward and Wells. In 1845, April 10th, a great fire destroyed about 1/3 of the total area of the city, including most of the large business houses and factories, the bridge over the Monongahela River, the large hotel known as the Monongahela House, and several churches, in all about 1,100 buildings. The legislature appropriated $50,000 for the relief of the sufferers. In 1889, the Great Flood at Johnstown, accompanied by a frightful loss of life and destruction of property, touched the common heart of humanity all over the world. The closeness of Johnstown geographically made the sorrow at Pittsburgh most poignant and profound. In a few hours, almost the whole population had brought its offerings for the stricken community, and besides clothing, provisions, and every conceivable thing necessary for relief and comfort, the people of Pittsburgh contributed $250,000 to restore so far as possible the material portion of the loss. In the autumn of 1908, a series of imposing celebrations was held to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the founding of Pittsburgh. End of section 15. Section 16 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 16. Historical, Chapter 16. In 1877, the municipal government, being, in its personnel, at the moment, incompetent to preserve the fundamental principles on which it was established, permitted a strike of railroad employees to grow without restriction as to the observance of law and order until it became an insurrection. $4 million worth of property was destroyed by riot and incendiarism in a few hours. When at last outraged authority was properly shifted from the supine city chieftains to the indomitable state itself, it became necessary, before order could be restored, for troops to fire, with the sacrifice of human life. For some months preceding the riots at Pittsburgh, disturbances among the railroad employees, especially the engineers and brakemen of freight trains, had been frequent on railroads west and east of this city. These disturbances arose mainly from resistance to reductions in the rates of wages made or proposed by the executive officers of the various railroads, and also from objections of train crews to regulations governing the transportation system. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company, some time after the Panic of 1873, reduced the wages of its employees 10% on account of the general decline in business. They made another reduction of 10%. To take effect on June 1, 1877, these reductions would apply to all employees from the president of the company down. The reductions affected the roads known as the Pennsylvania lines west of Pittsburgh, as well as the Pennsylvania Railroad, and similar alterations were also made on the New York Central and the Baltimore and Ohio railroads. The changed conditions caused a great deal of dissatisfaction among the trainmen, but a committee was appointed by them, which held a conference with Mr. Thomas A. Scott, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, and agreed to the reduction, reporting its conclusions to the trainmen. On July 16th, an order was issued by the railroad company that 36 freight cars, instead of 18, as before, were to be made up as a train, without increase in the number of crew, and with a locomotive at the end to act as a pusher, assisting the one at the front, making what is technically called a double header. The train employees looked upon this order as doubling their work under the decreased pay of June 1st, and in its effect virtually tending to the discharge of many men then employed in the running of freight trains. The strike which followed does not seem to have been seriously organized, but was rather a sudden conclusion arrived at on the impulse of the moment, and was probably strengthened by a wave of discontent which was sweeping over the roads to the east and west, as well as by an undercurrent of hostility toward the railroads exhibited by some of the newspapers. As far back as July 23, 1876, a Pittsburgh paper, in publishing an article headed "Railroad Vultures," had said, "Railroad officials are commencing to understand that the people of Pittsburgh will be patient no longer, that this community is being aroused into action, and that presently the torrent of indignation will give place to condign retribution." In another paragraph, the same paper had said, "We desire to impress upon the minds of the community that these vultures are constantly preying upon the wealth and resources of the country. They are a class, as it were, of money jugglers, intent only on practicing their trickery for self-aggrandizement, and that, consequently, their greed leads them into all known ways and byways of fraud, scheming, and speculating, to accomplish the amassing of princely fortunes." These intemperate utterances were the first seeds of popular sedition. It was not until 8:30 o'clock on the morning of the 19th that the real trouble began. 2 freight trains were to start at 8:40, but 10 minutes before that the crews sent word that they would not take the trains out. 2 yard crews were then asked to take their places, but they refused to do so. The trains were not taken out, and the crews of all the trains that came in, as they arrived, joined the strikers. As the day wore on, the men gradually congregated at the roundhouse of the road at 28th Street, but did not attempt or threaten any violence. The news of the strike had spread through the two cities, and large numbers of the more turbulent class of the population, together with many workmen from the factories who sympathized with the strikers, hastened to 28th Street, and there was soon gathered a formidable mob in which the few striking railroad employees were an insignificant quantity. When the railroad officials found their tracks and roundhouse in the possession of a mob which defied them, they called upon the mayor of the city for protection, to which Mayor McCarthy promptly responded, going in person with a detail of officers to the scene of the trouble. When the police arrived on the ground, they found an excited assemblage of people who refused to listen to their orders to disperse, and the mayor made no serious effort to enforce his authority effectually. There was no collision, however, until a man who had refused to join the strikers attempted to couple some cars when he was assaulted. An officer of the road who undertook to turn a switch was also assaulted by one of the mob, who was arrested by the police. His comrades began throwing stones, but the police maintained their hold of their prisoner and conveyed him to the jail. A crowd then gathered in front of the police station and made threats of rescuing their comrade, but no overt act was committed. The mob, which had by this time become greatly enraged, was really not composed of railroad employees, who had contemplated no such result of their strike, and now generally deplored the unfortunate turn which the affair had taken. It was for the most part composed of the worst element of the population, who, without any grievance of their own, real or imagined, had gathered together from the very force of their vicious inclinations and the active hope of plunder. The strikers held a meeting that evening at which they demanded that the 10% should be restored and the running of double headers abolished. In the meantime, the railroad authorities, perceiving the inefficiency of the local police powers, and alarmed at the still increasing mob and the vicious spirit which it displayed, invoked the aid of the sheriff of the county. At midnight, Sheriff Fife came to 28th Street with a hastily summoned posse, part of which deserted him before he reached the scene of the action, and ordered the rioters to disperse, which they, with hoots and jeers, defiantly refused to do. The sheriff then sought aid from the military, and General A.L. Pearson issued an order to the 18th and 19th Regiments of the National Guards of Pennsylvania, with headquarters at Pittsburgh, to assemble at 6:30 the next morning, armed and equipped for duty. Sheriff Fife also telegraphed to the state authorities at Harrisburg, stating that he was unable to quell the riot, and asking that General Pearson be instructed to do this with force, and Adjutant General Latta issued the orders accordingly. General Pearson marched his forces to the Union Depot and placed them in position in the yard and on the hillside above it. The mob was not, however, deterred by this action, as the troops were supposed to be more or less in sympathy with the strikers, and were expected to be disinclined to fire upon their fellow citizens if they should be ordered to do so. The employment of local troops in this moment constituted a grave mistake in the management of the riot. The governor had, however, been telegraphed to, and ordered General Brinton's division of troops to leave Philadelphia for Pittsburgh. This became known to the mob, which was still increasing in numbers and turbulence, and the calling of troops from the east drove them to fury. The feeling had spread to the working men in the factories on the south side, where a public meeting was held, and demagogical speeches made, upholding the action of the strikers, and 500 men came thence in a body and joined the crowd. At this critical moment, the mob received an endorsement that not only greatly encouraged it, but incited it to extreme violence. A local newspaper, on Friday the 20th, in the course of an editorial headed "The Talk of the Desperate," which formulated what was assumed as the expression of a working man, used this language: "This may be the great civil war in this country between labor and capital that is bound to come. The working men everywhere are in fullest sympathy with the strikers, and only waiting to see whether they are in earnest enough to fight for their rights. They would all join and help them the moment an actual conflict took place. The governor, with his proclamation, may call and call, but the laboring people, who mostly constitute the militia, won't take up arms to put down their brethren. Will capital then rely on the United States Army? Pshaw! Its 10,000 to 15,000 available men would be swept from our path like leaves in a whirlwind. The working men of this country can capture and hold it, if they will only stick together, and it looks as though they were going to do so this time. Of course, you say that capital will have some supporters. Many of the unemployed will be glad to get work as soldiers or extra policemen. The farmers, too, might turn out to preserve your law and order, but the working army would have the most men and the best men. The war might be bloody, but the right would prevail. Men like Tom Scott, Frank Thompson, yes, and William Thaw, who have got rich swindling the stockholders of railroads so that they cannot pay honest labor living rates, we would hang to the nearest tree. Although the paper in a later edition suppressed that part of the editorial, the other papers of the city refrained from any editorials that might increase the excitement, and yet the mischief had been done. The unfortunate words had been widely read, and the more intelligently vicious of the rioters proceeded to make the most of them. The Eastern troops left Philadelphia on Friday night and arrived at the Union Depot on Saturday afternoon, tired and hungry. After a scant and hasty lunch, they were placed out along the tracks to the roundhouse, where the great bulk of the mob was assembled. In order to secure and protect the building and tracks, it was necessary for the crowd to be forced back. When the troops undertook this movement, some stones were thrown and a few soldiers were hit. Then one of the subordinate officers gave an order to fire, and about 20 persons were killed and 30 wounded, 3 of whom were children. When the rioters beheld their associates attacked, their rage passed all control, and the troops were closed in upon and driven into the roundhouse. Encouraged by this retreat, the mob took steps to burn them out. Many cars loaded with whiskey and petroleum were set on fire and sent down the track against the building, and fire was opened on it with a cannon which the crowd had seized from a local armory. General Brinton came personally to one of the windows of the roundhouse and appealed to the mob to desist, warning them that if they did not, he must and would fire. The rioters paid no attention to his appeal, but continued their assaults, whereupon General Brinton gave orders to his men to fire at those who were handling the cannon, and several of them were killed and wounded. Incendiarism, having been inaugurated, went on through the night, whole trains being robbed and then burned. The troops held their position until Sunday morning, and then retreated out Penn Avenue to Sharpsburg, where they went into camp. During Saturday night and Sunday morning, the mob seemed to have taken possession of the city. They broke open several armories and gun stores, and supplied themselves with arms and ammunition. The banks were threatened, and the city seemed about to be pillaged, the business part of the city being filled with bands of rioters who uttered threats of violence and murder. On Sunday morning, the roundhouse and all the locomotives which it contained were destroyed by fire. The Union Depot, the grain elevator, the Adams Express building, and the Panhandle Depot were also set on fire and consumed. The firemen who hastened to the scene and attempted to extinguish the flames were met by armed men and driven back. At 12:30 on Sunday morning, a committee appointed by a citizens' meeting tried to open a consultation with the mob, but were promptly driven away. The committee found that they were not dealing with dissatisfied railroad employees, but with a mob of the worst of the city's population, there being neither organization nor leader, but each man or party of men doing what the frenzy of the moment suggested. When it seemed as if the whole city was to be destroyed, some of the original strikers were persuaded to attend a meeting of the citizens at 4 o'clock and arranged to aid in suppressing the incendiarism, and they did this with such a good spirit as showed that the railroad strikers were not a part of the mob and did not countenance its violence. At this meeting, the mayor was authorized to enroll 500 police, but the accounts of the day show that the ranks filled up slowly. The state of terror continued through all of Sunday night, and on Monday morning the mob was still in unorganized control. Throughout the 36 hours from Saturday night until Monday morning, a most unusual state of public mind developed here and there, which seemed like a moral epidemic. There was almost wholesale appropriation of goods from the burning cars by men and even women, who would at other times have shuddered at the idea of robbery, and after the riot was suppressed, goods were for some time voluntarily returned by persons who had taken them unreflectingly, having at length recovered their moral perceptions, which had seemingly been clouded by the vicious influence of the mob. On Monday morning, however, the uprooted law seemed to be recovering a portion of its dissipated majesty. During the night, posters had been placed conspicuously throughout the city, on which was printed the law under which the citizens of Allegheny County were liable for all the damage done by the mob or arising from its actions. At 11 o'clock in the morning, a meeting of citizens was called at the Chamber of Commerce to form a committee of public safety to take charge of the situation, as the city authorities, the sheriff, and the military seemed powerless to control it. This committee presented the following address to the public. The Committee of Public Safety, appointed at the meeting of citizens held at the Chamber of Commerce July 23rd, deeming that the allaying of excitement is the first step toward restoring order, would urge upon all citizens disposed to aid therein the necessity of pursuing their usual avocation and keeping all their employees at work, and would therefore request that full compliance be accorded to this demand of the committee. The committee are impressed with the belief that the police force now being organized will be able to arrest and disperse all riotous assemblages, and that much of the danger of destruction to property has passed, and that an entire restoration of order will be established. The committee believed that the mass of industrious workmen of the city are on the side of law and order, and a number of the so-called strikers are already in the ranks of the defenders of the city, and it is quite probable that any further demonstration will proceed from thieves and similar classes of population with whom our working classes have no affiliation and will not be found among them. It is to this end that the committee requests that all classes of business be prosecuted as usual, and our citizens refrain from congregating in the streets in crowds, so that the police of the city may not be confused in their effort to arrest rioters, and the military be not restrained from prompt action, if necessary, from fear of injuring the innocent. When the rioters had by this time been somewhat restrained by the resolute action of the committee, yet they were, although dispersed as a body, holding meetings and still breathing sullen threats of further outrage and murder. The strike had spread to the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railway, and its trains were, for 2 or 3 days, virtually stopped. In other sections of the country, the railroad troubles were increasing, and the committee thought best to call Major General Joseph Brown and Colonel P.N. Guthrie of the 18th National Guards into consultation. Under their advice, a camp of the military was formed at East Liberty, to be held in readiness for any further outbreak. Mayor McCarthy, at last inspirited by the determined men who urged him to his duty, enrolled 500 extra police, and issued a proclamation in which he said, "I have determined that peace, order, and quiet shall be restored to the community, and to this end call upon all good citizens to come forward at once to City Hall and unite with the police and military now organizing. I call upon all to continue quietly at their several places of business and refrain from participating in excited assemblages." A proclamation had also been issued by Governor Hartranft, as he had come to Pittsburgh to address the rioters, and subsequently 2,000 or 3,000 troops were ordered by him to Pittsburgh and were encamped near East Liberty for several days. Under these vigorous measures, quiet was in a few days restored, although the Committee of Public Safety continued to hold sessions and to take steps not only to prevent any further demonstrations, but to arrest and bring to punishment a number of the prominent rioters. Claims for losses in the riot were made on Allegheny County in the sum of $4,100,000, which the commissioners settled for $2,772,349.53. Of this sum, $1,600,000 was paid to the Pennsylvania Railroad, whose claim for $2,312,000 was settled for that sum. In addition to the buildings already specified as burned, there were 1,383 freight cars, 104 locomotives, and 66 passenger coaches destroyed by fire. 25 persons in all were killed. The lesson was worth all cost, and anarchy has never dared to raise its head in the corporation limits since that time. End of section 16. Section 17 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 17. Historical, Chapter 17. The Homestead Strike and Riot of 1892 is another incident of false leadership in industrial life which must be chronicled here. For many years, the Carnegie Steel Company, whose principal works were situated at Homestead, just outside the present boundaries of the city, had employed a large number of skilled workmen who belonged to the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, and had contracted for their employment with the officers of that association. On July 1, 1889, a 3-year contract was made which was to terminate at the end of June, 1892. The workmen were paid by the ton, the amount they received depending on the selling price of steel billets of a specified size which they produced. If the price of these billets advanced, the wages they received per ton advanced proportionately. If the price declined, their wages also declined to a certain point, called a minimum, but a decline in the selling price below this minimum caused no reduction in wages. The minimum was fixed in the contract at $25 per ton. At the date the contract was made, the market price of the billets was $26.50 per ton. As the time drew near for the contract to expire, the Carnegie Company, through its chairman, Mr. Henry C. Frick, submitted to the workmen belonging to the association a proposition as the basis of a new contract. The 3 most important features of the proposed contract were, first, a reduction in the minimum of the scale for billets from $25 to $22, second, a change in the expiration of the date of the scale from June 30th to December 31st, third, a reduction of tonnage rates at those furnaces and mills in which, by reason of the introduction of improved machinery, the earnings of the workmen had been increased far beyond the liberal calculation of their employers. At those places where no such improvements had been made, no reduction in tonnage rates was proposed. The company gave as a reason for reducing the minimum that the market price of steel had gone down below $25 per ton, and that it was unfair for the workmen to have the benefits of a rise in the market above $25 and share none of the losses of the company when the market price fell below that figure. Indeed, the company contended that there ought to be no minimum, as there was no maximum under the sliding scale. The workmen insisted that there ought to be a minimum in order to protect them against unfair dealing between the company and its buyers, as they had no voice or authority in selling the products of their labor. The reason for changing the time for closing the contract was that the company's business was less active at the end of the calendar year than in midsummer, and that it was easier to complete new arrangements for employment at that time. Another reason was that the company often made sales for an entire year, and consequently, contracts for labor could be more safely made if they began and ended at times corresponding with contracts made with their customers. The workmen opposed this change in the duration of the contract on the ground that in midwinter they would be less able to resist any disposition on the part of the company to cut down their wages, and that in the event of a strike, it would be more difficult to maintain their situation than it would be in summer. They claimed, therefore, that the change in time would be a serious disadvantage to them in negotiating with their employers. They proposed to the company, as a counter-proposition, that the contract should end the last of June, as had formerly been the case, and that if any change was to be demanded, 3 months' notice must be given them, and that, if this was not done, the contract, which was to run for 3 years, should continue a year longer, in other words, from June 30th, 1895, until June 30th, 1896. This suggestion was rejected by the company, but the company then proposed to make the minimum $23 per ton for steel billets, and the association, through its committee, named a price of $24, refusing to concede any more. While these negotiations were pending, the superintendent of the Homestead Steel Works had concluded contracts with all the employees, except 325 of the highest skill, who were employed in 3 of the 12 departments. All the others were to be paid on the former basis of remuneration without any reduction whatsoever. Of the 325 high-priced men with whom contracts had not been made, 280 would have been affected by the tonnage reductions, and about 45 more by the tonnage reductions and scale minimum. Under the proposed readjustments, those who received the low grades of compensation and the common laborers would not have been touched in their earnings. The actual controversy was thus narrowed down to a small number of men, less than 10% of those employed at Homestead. During the remainder of the month of June, other steps were taken to effect an agreement, but the relations between the officers of the company and the workmen, instead of improving, grew worse. On the 28th, the company began to close the different departments, and on the last day of the month, work in all of them ceased. On July 1st, the striking workmen congregated about the gates, stopped the foremen and employees who came to work, and persuaded them to go away. The watchmen of the company were turned away from the works, guards were placed at all the entrances, the river, the streets and roads entering the town were patrolled by strikers, and a rigid surveillance was exercised over those who entered the town or approached the plant. When the sheriff came on July 4th and attempted to put deputies of his own selection in possession of the works, to guard them for the company, he was opposed by a counterforce, the striking workmen proposing to place guards of their own and give indemnity for the safety of the property, but this the sheriff declined because it would enable the strikers to keep any new non-union men from taking their places. On July 5th, when the sheriff sent 12 deputies to take possession of the works, they were driven away. In the meantime, Mr. Frick had begun negotiations as early as June 20th, with Robert A. Pinkerton of New York, for the employment of 300 watchmen to be placed in the works at Homestead. They were brought from Ashtabula to Youngstown by rail, thence to Pittsburgh by river. On the evening of July 5th, Captain Rogers' 2 boats, with Deputy Sheriff Gray, Superintendent Potter of the Homestead Works, and some of his assistants on board, dropped down the river with 2 barges in tow until they met the Pinkerton men. When the boat, with the barges in tow, approached Homestead in the early morning of the 6th, they were discovered by a small steamer used by the strikers as a patrol, and the alarm was given. A short war of words was followed by firing on each side, which resulted ultimately in the death of 3 of the Pinkertons and 7 of the workmen, and the wounding of many on each side. After a brief fusillade, those on shore fled in various directions, and the Pinkerton men retreated into their barges. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the Pinkertons surrendered, being allowed to take out their clothing, but their arms and supplies fell into the possession of the Homestead people. The barges were immediately set on fire and burned, and in their burning the pump house belonging to the Carnegie Company was also destroyed. The Pinkerton men, now being practically prisoners of war, were marched uptown to the skating rink for temporary imprisonment. The sheriff was notified, and he came down that night and took the prisoners away. He then informed the governor of Pennsylvania of what had occurred, and called upon him for troops to enforce the law and restore public order. Governor Pattison made a prompt response to this appeal, as his duty under the law required him to do. On the morning of the 12th, the soldiers of the state militia entered Homestead. As soon as they arrived, the Carnegie Company took possession of its works and began to make preparations to resume work with the non-union men. It was difficult to secure employees, and several months passed away before the company was able to obtain all the men it desired. At first, the new employees were fed and housed within the enclosure, and this plan continued for several weeks until their number had increased to such a degree that they felt secure in going outside for their meals, with the protection afforded by the sheriff's deputies. The company made an effort to employ their old workmen, and fixed a time for receiving applications for employment from them. When the time had expired, however, which was on July 21st, not one participant in the strike had returned. At a later period, many of the old employees returned to work. By the close of July, nearly 1,000 men were at work at Homestead. On July 23rd, Mr. Frick was shot in his office by Alexander Berkman, an anarchist, who was not and never had been an employee. The chairman recovered from his wounds, and his assailant was sent to the penitentiary. The last of the troops were not withdrawn until October 13th. At that time, the mill was in full operation with non-union men. Though the strike was ended in October, its formal termination by the Amalgamated Association was not declared until November 20th, when the disposition of the strikers to return to work was very general. Assuming that the strike lasted nearly 5 months, as the monthly payroll of the mill was about $250,000, the loss to the striking employees for that period was not far from $1,250,000. No estimate of the loss sustained by the company has been published. The cost to the state in sending and maintaining the National Guard at Homestead was $440,256.31. End of section 17. Section 18 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 18. Industrial, Chapter 1. Pittsburgh has thus passed through many battles, trials, afflictions, and adversities, and has grown in the strength of giants until it now embraces in the limits of the county a population rapidly approaching 1 million. This seems to be a proper moment, therefore, turning away from the romantic perspective of history to attempt a brief description of Pittsburgh as we see her today. In order to give value to the record, it will be necessary to employ certain statistics, but the effort will be to make these figures as little wearisome as possible. The present population, after the annexation of Allegheny, December 6, 1907, is estimated at 550,000, and if we were to add McKeesport with its tube mills, Homestead with its Carnegie Works, and East Pittsburgh with its Westinghouse plants, all of which lie just outside of the present corporate limits, the population would be 700,000. In 1900, we can give the population definitely, omitting Allegheny, at 321,616, of whom 85,032 were foreign-born and 17,040 were Negroes. Of these foreign-born, 21,222 were natives of Germany, 18,620 of Ireland, 8,902 of England, 6,243 of Russian Poland, 5,709 of Italy, 4,107 of Russia, 3,553 of Austria, 3,515 of German Poland, 2,539 of Wales, 2,264 of Scotland, 2,124 of Hungary, 1,072 of Sweden, 1,025 of Austrian Poland, and 154 Chinese. End of section 18. Section 19 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 19. Industrial, Chapter 2. It has already been said that the city is a gateway from the east to the west and south, and as such it is the center of a vast railway system. The principal railroads serving Pittsburgh are the Pennsylvania, Baltimore and Ohio, the New York Central lines, and the Wabash system, and she has also a numerous fleet of boats plying the three rivers. Coal is brought to the city by boats as well as by rail, and great fleets of barges carry it and other heavy freight down the Ohio. A ship canal for the establishment of water transportation between Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, 127.5 miles, has been projected. The railroads carry through Pittsburgh over 8% of all the railroad traffic of the United States, and have a particularly heavy tonnage of coal, coke, and iron and steel products, while a large proportion of the iron ore that is produced in the Lake Superior region is brought here to supply Pittsburgh manufacturers. The total railway and river tonnage is greater than that of any other city in the world, amounting in 1906 to 122 million tons, of which about 12 million tons were carried on boats down the Ohio. Her tonnage is equal to 1/2 the combined tonnage of the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. The following table will be very interesting as showing the extraordinary fact that the tonnage of Pittsburgh exceeds the combined tonnage of the 5 other greatest cities in the world, 1902. Pittsburgh, 86,636,680 tons. London, 17,564,110 tons. New York, 17,398,000 tons. Antwerp, 16,721,000 tons. Hamburg, 15,853,490 tons. Liverpool, 13,157,720 tons. Total, 80,694,320 tons. Pittsburgh's excess, 5,942,360 tons. Pittsburgh has freight yards with a total capacity for more than 60,000 cars. Its harbor has a total length on the three rivers of 28 miles, with an average width of about 1,000 feet, and has been deepened by the Davis Island Dam, 1885, and by dredging. Slack water navigation has been secured on the Allegheny River by locks and dams at an expense of more than $1.25 million. The Monongahela River, from Pittsburgh to the West Virginia state line, 91.5 miles, was improved by a private company in 1836, which built 7 locks and dams. This property was condemned and bought by the United States government in 1897 for $3,761,615, and the government is planning to rebuild and enlarge these works. Pittsburgh is surrounded by the most productive coal fields in the country. The region is also rich in petroleum and natural gas, and although the petroleum in the immediate vicinity has been nearly exhausted, it is still obtained through pipes from the neighboring regions. The first petroleum pipeline reached Pittsburgh in 1875. Pittsburgh is also a port of entry, and for the year ending December 1907, the value of its imports amounted to $2,416,637. In 1806, the manufacture of iron was begun, and by 1825 this had become the leading industry. Among the earlier prominent iron industries was the Kensington Iron Works, of which Samuel Church, born February 5, 1800, died December 7, 1857, whose family has been resident in Pittsburgh from 1822 to the present day, was the leading partner. In the manufacture of iron and steel products, Pittsburgh ranks first among the cities of the United States, their value in 1905 amounting to $92,939,860, or 53.3% of the total of the whole country. Several towns in the near neighborhood are also extensively engaged in the same industry, and in 1902, Allegheny County produced about 24% of the pig iron, nearly 34% of the Bessemer steel, 44% of the open hearth steel, 53% of the crucible steel, 24% of the steel rails, and 59% of the structural shapes that were made that year in the United States. In 1905, the value of Pittsburgh's foundry and machine shop products amounted to $9,631,514. Of the product of steam railroad repair shops, $3,726,990. Of malt liquors, $3,166,829. Of slaughtering and meat packing products, $2,732,027. Of cigars and cigarettes, $2,297,228. Of glass, $2,130,540. And of tin and turn plate, $1,645,570. Electrical machinery, apparatus, and supplies were manufactured largely in the city to a value in 1905 of $1,796,557. The Heinz Company has its main pickle plant in Pittsburgh, the largest establishment of its kind in the world. Pittsburgh's first glass works was built in 1797 by James O'Hara. In 1900, and for a long period preceding, the town ranked first among American cities in the manufacture of glass, but in 1905 it was outranked in this industry by Muncie, Indiana, Millville, New Jersey, and Washington, Pennsylvania. But in the district outside of the limits of Pittsburgh, much glass is manufactured, so that the Pittsburgh Glass District is still the greatest in the country. In Pittsburgh or its immediate vicinity, the more important plants of the United States Steel Corporation are located, including the Carnegie Works at Homestead. Just outside the limits, also, are the plants of the Westinghouse Company for the manufacture of electrical apparatus, of air brakes, which George Westinghouse invented in 1868, and of devices for railway signals, which he also invented. Alexander Johnston Cassatt, one of the greatest of the Pennsylvania Railroad presidents, and perhaps the most far-seeing and resourceful of all of our captains of industry of the present generation, was born here. James McCree, the present wise and conservative president of that railroad, lived here for 20 years. Andrew Carnegie, Henry Phipps, and Henry C. Frick were the strongest personalities who grew up with the Carnegie steel interests. George Westinghouse, whose inventive genius, as shown in his safety appliances, has so greatly reduced the hazards of railway travel and of operation, has long been one of the industrial and social pillars of the community. John A. Brashear, astronomer and educator, the maker of delicate instruments, is a well-beloved citizen. Pittsburgh ranks high as a banking center. She is the second city in the United States in banking capital and surplus, and leads all American cities in proportion of capital and surplus to gross deposits, with 47.1%, while Philadelphia ranks second with 26%. In 1906, there were 179 banks and trust companies in the Pittsburgh district, with a combined capital of $72,058,402 and a surplus of $87,044,622. The gross deposits were $395,379,783, while the total resources amounted to $593,392,069. Pittsburgh, with clearinghouse exchanges amounting to $2,640,847,046, ranks sixth among the cities of the United States, being exceeded by the following cities in the order named: New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, and St. Louis, and often on a given day exceeds those of St. Louis. End of section 19. Section 20 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 20. Industrial, Chapter 3. The tax valuation of Pittsburgh property is $609,623,427. She mines 1/4 of the bituminous coal of the United States. With an invested capital of $641 million, she has 3,029 mills and factories, with an annual product worth $551 million, and 250,000 employees on a payroll of about $1 million a day, or $350 million a year. Her electric street railway system multiplies itself through her streets for 492 miles. Natural gas fuel is conveyed into her mills and houses through 1,000 miles of iron pipe. Her output of coke makes one train 10 miles long every day throughout the year. 700 passenger trains and 10,000 loaded freight cars run to and from her terminals every day. Nowhere else in the world is there so large a Bessemer steel plant, crucible steel plant, plate glass plant, chimney glass plant, table glass plant, air brake plant, steel rail plant, cork works, tube works, or steel freight car works. Her armor sheaths our battleships, as well as those of Russia and Japan. She equips the navies of the world with projectiles and rangefinders. Her bridges span the rivers of India, China, Egypt, and the Argentine Republic, and her locomotives, rails, and bridges are used on the Siberian Railroad. She builds electric railways for Great Britain and Brazil, and telescopes for Germany and Denmark. Indeed, she distributes her varied manufactures into the channel of trade all over the earth. End of section 20. Section 21 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 21. Intellectual, Chapter 1. But while these stupendous industries have given Pittsburgh her wealth, population, supremacy, and power, commercial materialism is not the ultimate goal of her people. Travelers who come to Pittsburgh, forgetting the smoke which often dims the blue splendor of its skies, are struck with the picturesque situation of the town, for they find rolling plateaus, wide rivers, and narrow valleys dropping down from high hills, or precipitous bluffs throughout the whole district over which the city extends. Yet the surpassing beauty of nature is not more impressive to the thinking stranger than the work of man who has created and dominates a vast industrial system. The manufactories extend for miles along the banks of all three rivers. Red fires rise heavenward from gigantic forges where iron is being fused into wealth. The business section of the city is wedged in by the rivers, its streets are swarming with people, and there is a myriad of retail houses, wholesale houses, banks, tall office buildings, hotels, theaters, and railway terminals. But right where these stop, the residence section begins like another city of happy homes, an immense garden of verdant trees and flowering lawns, divided off by beautiful avenues, where some houses rise, which in Europe would be called castles and palaces, with scarce a fence to mark the landlines, giving an aspect almost of a park rather than of a city. There are many miles of asphalt streets set off with grass plots. On the rolling hills above the Monongahela River is Shenley Park, about 440 acres, with her beautiful drives, winding bridle paths, and shady walks through narrow valleys and over small streams. Above the Allegheny River is Highland Park, about 290 acres, containing a placid lake and commanding fine views from the summits of its great hills. It also contains a very interesting zoological garden. Close to Shenley Park are Homewood and Calvary cemeteries, and near Highland Park is Allegheny Cemetery, where the dead sleep amidst drooping willows and shading elms. Connecting the two parks and leading to them from the downtown section is a system of wide boulevards about 20 miles in length. On the north side, once Allegheny, is Riverview Park, 217 acres, in which the Allegheny Observatory is situated. A large number of handsome bridges span the rivers. The Pittsburgh Country Club provides a broad expanse of rolling acres for pastoral sports. End of section 21. Section 22 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 22. Intellectual, Chapter 2. In Shenley Park is the Carnegie Institute, with its new main building, dedicated in April 11th, 12th, and 13th, 1907, with imposing ceremonies which were attended by several hundred prominent men from America and Europe. This building, which is about 600 feet long and 400 feet wide, contains a library, an art gallery, halls of architecture and sculpture, a museum, and a hall of music, while the Carnegie Technical Schools are operated in separate buildings nearby. It is built in the later Renaissance style, being very simple and yet beautiful. Its exterior is of Ohio sandstone, while its interior finish is largely in marble, of which there are 65 varieties, brought from every famous quarry in the world. In its great entrance hall is a series of mural decorations by John W. Alexander, a distinguished son of Pittsburgh. The library, in which the institution had its beginning in 1895, contains about 300,000 volumes, has 7 important branches, and 177 stations for the distribution of books. Mr. Edwin H. Anderson inaugurated the library at the time of its creation. and, after several years of successful service, was followed by Mr. Anderson H. Hopkins, and he by Mr. Harrison W. Craver, who is now the efficient librarian. The Fine Arts Department contains many casts of noble works of architecture and sculpture, sufficient to carry the visitor in fancy through an almost unbroken development from the earliest times in which man began to produce beautiful structures to the present day. It is now the aim of this department to develop its galleries on 3 lines. First, to gather early American paintings from the very beginning of art in this country. Second, to acquire such portraits of eminent men as will, in the very passage of years, make these halls to some extent a national portrait gallery. And third, to obtain such pieces of contemporary art as will lead to the formation of a thoroughly representative collection of modern painting. The art gallery is already rich in this latter purpose, and is renowned for its annual competitive exhibits, which are open to the artists of all countries, for prizes offered by the Carnegie Institute. Mr. John W. Beatty, Director of Fine Arts, has made the building up of this department his ripest and best work. The museum embraces sections of paleontology, mineralogy, vertebrate and invertebrate zoology, entomology, botany, comparative anatomy, archaeology, numismatics, ceramics, textiles, transportation, carvings in wood and ivory, historical collections, the useful arts, and biological sciences. Its work in the Department of Paleontology is particularly noteworthy, as it has extended the boundaries of knowledge through its many explorations in the western fossil fields. The success of the museum is largely due to the energy and erudition of Dr. W. J. Holland, its amiable director. In the music hall, a symphony orchestra is maintained, and free recitals are given on the great organ twice every week by a capable performer. When the orchestra began its work 13 years ago, it is doubtful if there were very many persons in Pittsburgh, other than musical students, who knew the difference between a symphony, a suite, a concerto, and a fugue. Today there are thousands of people in this city who can intelligently describe the shading differences in the Ninth Symphony and give good reasons for their preference as between the 2 movements of the unfinished. The first conductor of the orchestra was Frederick Archer for 3 years, who was followed by Victor Herbert for 3 years, and then came Emile Parr, who is now in charge. The technical schools embrace a school of applied science, a school for apprentices and journeymen, a school of applied design, and a school for women, and already possess a capable faculty of 115 members, and a student body numbering 1,916. Dr. Arthur A. Hammerschlag is an enthusiastic and capable director of this educational scheme. The institute is governed by a board of trustees, of which William N. Frew is president, Robert Pitcairn vice president, Samuel Harden Church secretary, and James H. Reed treasurer. Charles C. Mellon is chairman of the museum committee, John Caldwell of the Fine Arts Committee, George A. Macbeth of the Library Committee, and William Conway of the Technical Schools Committee. The annual celebration of Founders Day at the Carnegie Institute has become one of the most notable platform occasions in America, made so by the illustrious men who participate in the exercises. Some of these distinguished orators are William McKinley and Grover Cleveland, former presidents of the United States, John Morley and James Bryce, foremost among British statesmen and authors, Joseph Jefferson, a beloved actor, Richard Watson Gilder, editor and poet, Wu Ting Fong, Chinese diplomat, and Whitelaw Reid, editor and ambassador. At the great dedication of the new building in April 1907, the celebration of Founders Day surpassed all previous efforts, being marked by the assembling of an illustrious group of men and the delivery of a series of addresses, which made the festival altogether beyond precedent. On that occasion there came to Pittsburgh, as the guests of the Institute from France, Dr. Léonce Benedict, Director Musée du Luxembourg, Baron de Tournelle de Constant, member of the French Senate and of the Hague Court of Arbitration, Dr. Paul Dumay, late Governor-General of Cochin, China, and Dr. Camille Enlard, Director of the Trocadero Museum from Germany. Upon the personal suggestion of His Majesty, Emperor William II, His Excellency Lieutenant General Alfred von Lohenfeld, Adjutant General to His Majesty the Emperor, Colonel Gustave Dickhuth, Lecturer on Military Science to the Royal Household, Dr. Ernst von Inn, Hof Architect Sergeant Major de Kaisers, Dr. Reinhold Koser, Principal Director of the Prussian State Archives, and Professor Dr. Fritz Schaper, sculptor. From Great Britain, Mr. William Archer, author and critic, Sir Robert S. Ball, Director of Cambridge Observatory, Dr. C. F. Moberly Bell, Manager, London Times, Sir Robert Cranston, late Lord Provost of Edinburgh, Sir Edward Elgar, composer, Mr. James Curry Macbeth, Provost of Dunfermline, Dr. P. Chalmers Mitchell, Secretary, Zoological Society of London, Sir William Henry Preece, Consulting Engineer to the GPO and Colonies, Dr. John Rice, Principal of Jesus College, University of Oxford, Dr. Ernest S. Roberts, Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, Mr. William Robertson, Member Dunfermline Trust, Dr. John Ross, Chairman Dunfermline Trust, and Dr. William Stead, Editor, Review of Reviews, and from Holland, Jonkier R. de Maries van Swinderen, Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary to the United States, and Dr. Jus Marius Willem van der Putten Schwartz, Martin Martens, author. Mr. Andrew Carnegie has founded this splendid institute with its school system at a cost already approximating $20 million, and he must enjoy the satisfaction of knowing it to be the rallying ground for the cultured and artistic life of the community. The progress made each year goes by in leaps and bounds, so much that we might well employ the phrase used by Macaulay to describe Lord Bacon's philosophy. The point which was yesterday invisible is today its starting point, and tomorrow will be its goal. The Institute has truly a splendid mission. End of section 22. Section 23 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Intellectual, Chapter 3. The University of Pittsburgh was opened about 1770 and incorporated by the legislature in 1787 under the name Pittsburgh Academy. In 1819, the name was changed to the Western University of Pennsylvania, but, holding to the narrower scope of a college, it did not really become a university until 1892, when it formed the Department of Medicine by taking over the Western Pennsylvania Medical College. In 1895, the departments of law and pharmacy were added, and women were for the first time admitted. In 1896, the Department of Dentistry was established. In 1908, July 11th, the name was changed to the University of Pittsburgh. The several departments of the university are at present, 1908, located in different parts of the city, but a new site of 43 acres has been acquired near Shenley Park, on which it is planned to bring them all together. These new plans have been drawn under the direction of the Chancellor, Dr. Samuel Black McCormick, whose faith in the merit of his cause is bound to remove whole mountains of financial difficulties. The university embraces a college and engineering school, a school of mines, a graduate department, a summer school, evening classes, Saturday classes, besides departments of astronomy, law, medicine, pharmacy, and dentistry. It now has a core of 151 instructors and a body of 1,138 students. End of section 23. Section 24 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 24. Intellectual, Chapter 4. The author ventures to repeat in this little book a suggestion which has been made by him several times, looking to a working cooperation or even a closer bond of union between the Carnegie Institute and the University of Pittsburgh. In an address delivered at the Carnegie Institute on Founders' Day, 1908, the author made the following remarks on this subject. The temptation to go a little further into the future first requires the acknowledgment which St. Paul made when he wrote of marriage. I speak not by authority, but by sufferance. There will soon begin to rise on these adjacent heights the first new buildings of the Western University, now University of Pittsburgh, conceived in the classic spirit of Greece and crowning that hill like a modern Acropolis. With its charter dating back 125 years, the university is already venerable in this land. Is it not feasible to hope that through the practical benevolence of our people, some working basis of union can be effected between that institution and this? Here we have painting and sculpture and architecture and books, and a wonderfully rich scientific collection, and the abiding spirit of music. We have these fast-growing technical schools, and yet the entire scheme seems to be lacking something which marks its unfinished state. The technical schools do not and should not teach languages, literature, philosophy, and the fine arts, nor the old learned professions, but these must always rest in the university. Should not one school thus supplement the other? And then the students on each side of this main building would find available here those great collections which, if properly demonstrated, would give them a larger opportunity for systematic culture than could be offered by any other community in the world. For we should no longer permit these great departments of the fine arts and the sciences to remain in a passive state, but they should all be made the means of active instruction from masterful professors. Music, its theory, composition, and performance on every instrument should be taught where demonstrations could be made with the orchestra and the organ. Successful painters and sculptors, the elected members of the fine faculty, should fix their studios near the institute and teach painting and sculpture as well as it could be done in Paris or Munich. Architecture should thrive by the hand of its trained votaries, while science could continue to reveal the secrets of her most attractive mysteries. Then, as the ambitious youths of the ancient world came to Athens to obtain the purest culture of that age, so would our modern youths, who are already in the Carnegie Technical Schools from 26 states, continue to come to Pittsburgh to partake of the most comprehensive scheme of education which the world would obtain. Believing firmly in the achieving power of hopeful thought, I pray you think on this. End of section 24. Section 25 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 25, Intellectual, Chapter 5. In the East End is the Pennsylvania College for Women, Presbyterian, chartered in 1869, which has 102 students. On the north side, Allegheny, are the Allegheny Theological Seminary, United Presbyterian, founded in 1825, which has 6 instructors and 61 students. The Western Theological Seminary, Presbyterian, opened in 1827, with 64 students and 12 instructors, and a library of 34,000 volumes, and the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, founded in 1856. There are 5 high schools and a normal academy, and also the following private academies: Pittsburgh Academy for both boys and girls, East Liberty Academy for boys, Lady of Mercy Academy for girls and for boys in the lower grades, the Stuart Mitchell School for girls, the Gleam School for girls, the Thurston School for girls, and the Ursuline Young Ladies Academy. The Phipps Conservatory, Horticulture, the largest in America, and the Hall of Botany are in Shenley Park and were built by Mr. Henry Phipps. There is an interesting zoological garden in Highland Park, which was founded by Mr. Christopher L. McGee. The Pittsburgh Gazette, founded July 29, 1786, and consolidated with the Pittsburgh Times, 1879, in 1906 as the Gazette-Times, is one of the oldest newspapers west of the Allegheny Mountains. Other prominent newspapers of the city are the Chronicle-Telegraph, 1841, Post, 1842, Dispatch, 1846, Leader, 1870, Sunday, 1864, Press, 1883, and The Sun, 1906. There are also 2 German dailies, the Volksblatt und Freiheitsfreund, and the Pittsburgher Beobachter, 1 Slavonic daily, 1 Slavonic weekly, 2 Italian weeklies, besides journals devoted to society and the iron, building, and glass trades. The publishing house of the United Presbyterian Church is located here, and there are several periodical journals published by various religious bodies. The city has some very attractive public buildings and office buildings, and an unusual number of beautiful churches. The Allegheny County Courthouse, in the Romanesque style, erected in 1884 to 1888 at a cost of $2,500,000, is one of Henry H. Richardson's masterpieces. The Nixon Theater is a notable piece of architecture. The post office and the customs office are housed in a large government building of polished granite. The city has 20 or more hospitals for the care of its sick, injured, or insane, 10 of which have schools for the training of nurses. There is the Western Pennsylvania Institute for the Instruction of the Deaf and Dumb in Pittsburgh, which is in part maintained by the state, where trades are taught as part of the educational system. The state also helps to maintain the Western Pennsylvania Institution for the Blind, the Home for Aged and Infirm Colored Women, and the Home for Colored Children. Among other charitable institutions maintained by the city are the Home for Orphans, Home for the Aged, Home for Released Convicts, an extensive system of public baths, the Curtis Home for Destitute Women and Girls, the Pittsburgh Newsboys Home, the Children's Aid Society of Western Pennsylvania, the Protestant Home for Incurables, the Pittsburgh Association for the Improvement of the Poor, and the Western Pennsylvania Humane Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, Children, and Aged Persons. Under the management of women's clubs, several playgrounds are open to children during the summer, where competent teachers give instruction to children over 10 years of age in music, manual training, sewing, cooking, nature study, and color work. The water supply of Pittsburgh is taken from the Allegheny River and pumped into reservoirs, the highest of which is Heron Hill, 530 feet above the river. A slow sand filtration plant for the filtration of the entire supply is under construction, and a part of it is in operation. In this last year, the legislature has passed an act prohibiting the deposit of sewage material into the rivers of the state, and this tardy action in the interest of decency and health will stop the ravages of death through epidemic fevers caught from poisoned streams. End of section 25. Section 26 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 26. Intellectual, Chapter 6. Pittsburgh maintains by popular support one of the 4 symphony orchestras in America. She has given many famous men to science, literature, and art. Her astronomical observatory is known throughout the world. Her rich men are often liberal beyond their own needs, particularly so William Thaw, who spent great sums for education and benevolence. Mrs. Mary Shenley, who has given the city a great park, over 400 acres in the very heart of its boundaries, and Henry Phipps, who erected the largest conservatory for plants and flowers in our country. There is one other, Andrew Carnegie, whose wise and continuous use of vast wealth for the public good is nearly beyond human precedent. If Pittsburgh people were called upon to name their best-known singer, they would, of course, with one accord, say Stephen C. Foster. His songs are verily written in the hearts of millions of his fellow creatures. For who has not sung Old Folks at Home, Nellie Bly, My Old Kentucky Home, and the others? Ethelbert Nevin is the strongest name among our musical composers, his Narcissus, The Rosary, and many others being known throughout the world. Charles Stanley Reinhardt, Mary Cassatt, and John W. Alexander are the best known among our painters. Henry O. Tanner, the only Negro painter, was born in Pittsburgh and learned the rudiments of his art here. Albert S. Wall, his son, A. Bryan Wall, George Hetzel, and John W. Beatty have painted good pictures, as have another group which includes William A. Coffin, Martin B. Lesser, Jasper Lawman, Eugene A. Poole, Joseph R. Woodwell, William H. Singer, Clarence M. Johns, and Joanna Woodwell Hillman. Thomas S. Clark is a Pittsburgh painter and sculptor. Philander C. Knox, United States Senator, and John Dalzell, member of the House of Representatives, are prominent among those who have served Pittsburgh ably in the national government. End of section 26. Section 27 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 27, Intellectual, Chapter 7. And how about letters? Has Pittsburgh a literature? Those rolling clouds of smoke, those mighty industries, those men of brawn, those men of energy, that ceaseless calculation of wages and dividends, can these produce an atmosphere for letters? It seems unthinkable. Yet hold! Only the other day on the train, a man who has been a resident of New York for 35 years remarked in this author's presence that Pittsburgh is the most intellectual city in America. He had never visited Pittsburgh, and the author did not and does not know his name. How about Boston? Asked another traveler. Boston used to be, but is not now, he answered. Then I, in my timid and artless way, ventured to ask him why he spoke thus of Pittsburgh. Because, said he, distant as I am from Pittsburgh, more inspiration in artistic and intellectual things has come to me from that city than from any other place in America. But that may have been his dinner or the cigar. Literature I once attempted to define as the written record of thought and action. If this be an adequate definition, then Pittsburgh writers have substantially enriched the field of literature in every department, and given our city permanent fame as a place of letters. As we begin our survey of the local field, the wonder grows that the literary production is so large, and that the character of much of it is so very high. Let Pegasus champ his golden bit as he may, and beat his hoof upon the empty air, Pittsburgh men and Pittsburgh women have ridden the classic steed with grace and skill through all the flowered deviations of his bridle paths. This is scarcely the place to attempt a critical estimate, and it would be an ungracious and a presumptuous task for me to appraise the literary value of that work with any great degree of detail. The occasion will hardly permit more than a list of names and titles, and while pains have been taken to make this list complete, it is possible that some books may have been overlooked, but truly by inadvertence only. End of section 27. Section 28 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 28. Intellectual, Chapter 8. Perhaps the most important piece of literature from a local pen is Professor William M. Sloane's Life of Napoleon. This is a painstaking and authoritative record of the great Frenchman who conquered everybody but himself. Dr. William J. Holland, once Chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh, now Director of the Carnegie Museum, has given to the field of popular science the Butterfly Book, an author who knows every butterfly by its Christian name. Then Andrew Carnegie's Triumphant Democracy presents masses of statistics with such lightness of touch as to make them a stirring narrative. His other books, An American Foreign Hand in Britain and Round the World, present the vivid impressions of a keen traveler. His Life of James Watt conveys a sympathetic portraiture of the inventor of the steam engine. His Gospel of Wealth is a piece of deep-thinking discursiveness, although it really seems a superfluous thesis, for Mr. Carnegie's best exposition of the Gospel of Wealth unfolds itself in 2,000 noble buildings erected all over the world for the diffusion of literature. In those splendid conceptions, the Scottish Education Fund, the Washington Carnegie Institution for Scientific Research, the pension for college professors, which has so much advanced the dignity and security of teaching, the pension for aged and disabled workmen, the Hero Fund, with its provision of aid to the injured and to the worthy poor, the many college endowments, and, greater than all, the Peace Palace at The Hague, through which he will make his appeal to the conscience of civilization during all time to organize and extend among nations of the earth that system of arbitrated justice which has already been established within the borders of each state. But if I continue to group our Pittsburgh authors in this arbitrary fashion, those who come at the end will think I mean the last to be least. Therefore, let me pursue the theme indiscriminately, as I meant to do all along, had not that same Pegasus, in spite of my defiance, run away at the very start. End of section 28. Section 29 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 29. Intellectual, Chapter 9. The first Pittsburgh book that I can find in my hurried review of the field is Modern Chivalry by Hugh Henry Brackenridge. The third volume of this book was printed in Pittsburgh in 1796, the first two having been published in Philadelphia. This writer's son, Henry M. Brackenridge, was also an author, having written History of the Late War between the United States and Great Britain, History of the Western Insurrection called the Whiskey Insurrection, 1794, Journal of a Voyage up the River Missouri, performed in 1811, Recollections of Persons and Places in the West, and several other books. Neville B. Craig wrote A History of Pittsburgh, published in 1851, which is still a work of standard reference. Another history of Pittsburgh was brought out some 10 years ago, under the editorship of Erasmus Wilson, who has also published a volume of quiet observations selected from his newspaper essays. But the most important, painstaking, and accurate history of Pittsburgh, which has yet been published, is the one by Miss Sarah H. Killikelly, published in 1906. Another book of hers, Curious Questions, is an entertaining collection of many queer things that have occurred in the world's history. Robert P. Nevin wrote Black Robes and Three Kings. Professor Samuel P. Langley was for many years in charge of the Allegheny Observatory, and won fame while here as a writer on scientific subjects. Also, the first models of his flying machine were made while he was a resident in Pittsburgh. W. M. Darlington wrote Fort Pitt and edited the journals of Christopher Gist, who was Washington's scout when the father of his country first came to Pittsburgh. Two Men in the West is the title of a little book on travel by W. R. Halpin. Arthur G. Burgoyne, a newspaper writer, has published all sorts of Pittsburghers. George Siebel has written 3 beautiful plays which have not yet been produced because the modern stage managers seem to produce unbeautiful plays. One of these is Omar Khayyam, which was accepted and paid for by Richard Mansfield, who died before he could arrange for its production. Another is Christopher Columbus, and he has just finished an important tragedy entitled Oedipus, dealing artistically with a horrifying story, which has been accepted for early production by Mr. Robert Mantell. Mr. Siebel has published a monograph on the Mormon problem. Charles P. Shearish wrote The Redemption of Labor and a drama, The Invisible Prince, which was played in the Old Pittsburgh Theater. Bartley Campbell was the most prolific writer of plays that Pittsburgh has yet produced, and his melodramas have been played in nearly every theater in America. H. G. Donnelly, well known as a playwright, was also a Pittsburgher. Mrs. Mary Roberts Reinhardt is a young author who is coming to the front as a writer of successful dramas, stories, and books. Her plays, The Double Life and By Order of the Court, have been produced, and a novel, The Circular Staircase, has just appeared from the press. My own little play, The Brayton Episode, was played by Miss Sarah Truax at the Alvin Theater, Pittsburgh, June 24, 1903, and by Miss Eleanor Moretti at the Fifth Avenue Theater, New York, January 15, 1905. Reverend W. G. Mackay wrote Tales of History under the title of The Skein of Life. Father Morgan M. Sheedy and Reverend Dr. George Hodges, who used to strive together in Pittsburgh to surpass each other in tearing down the walls of religious prejudice that keep people out of the kingdom of heaven, have each given us several books on social and religious topics, composed on the broad and generous lines of thought which only such sensible teachers know how to employ. Among Dr. Hodges' books are Christianity Between Sundays, The Heresy of Cain, and Faith and Social Service, while Father Sheedy has published Social Topics. That devoted student of nature, Dr. Benjamin Cutler Gilson, wrote a book called Home Geology, and another, River Terraces in and Near Pittsburgh, which carry the fancy into far-off antiquity. Professor Daniel Carhart of the University of Pittsburgh has given us Fieldwork for Civil Engineers and Treatise on Plain Surveying. From J. Heron Foster we have A Full Account of the Great Fire at Pittsburgh in 1845. Adelaide M. Nevin published Social Mirror, and Robert P. Nevin, Poems, a book with mood and feeling. Dr. Stephen A. Hunter, a clergyman, is the author of an erudite work entitled Manual of Therapeutics and Pharmacy in the Chinese Language. Walter Scott, who, after taking a course at the University of Edinburgh, came to Pittsburgh in 1826, was a very distinguished preacher and author. His greatest reputation was gained in his work in association with Alexander Campbell in establishing the principles of the now mighty congregation known as the Christian, or Disciples, Church. His books are The Gospel Restored, The Great Demonstration, and The Union of Christians. A memoir of Professor John L. Lincoln by his son W. L. Lincoln gives a record of a life so spent that many men were truly made better thereby. Father Andrew A. Lambing, president of the Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania, has written useful monographs on the early history of this region, and he is one of the first authorities in that field. He has also composed books on religious subjects. E. W. Duckwell wrote Bacteriology Applied to the Canning and Preserving of Food Products. Richard Realf was a poet whose songs gushed from his heart, and some of them hold a place in literature. His Monarch of the Forges breathes the deep spirit of industrial life as he found it in Pittsburgh. Mr. Lee S. Smith, now, 1908, president of the Chamber of Commerce, has published an interesting book entitled Through Egypt to Palestine, describing his travels in the Orient. Our men who have written most knowingly on industrial topics are James M. Swank and Joseph D. Weeks. A young writer, Francis Hill, has published a very readable boys' story, Outlaws of Horseshoe Hole, and Arthur Stanwood Peer has published The Pedagogues, a novel satirizing the Harvard Summer School. Reverend Henry C. McCook's very successful novel, The Latimers, is an engaging study of the whiskey insurrection of early Pittsburgh days. Thomas B. Plimpton is remembered by some as a writer of verse. Judge J. E. Park and Judge Joseph Mellon have written historical essays. Josiah Copley wrote Gathering Beulah. Logan Conway is the author of Money and Banking. He has also written a series of essays on evolution. Miss Cara Reese has published a little story entitled And She Got All That. Miss Willa Siebert Cather has just published her poems. Charles McKnight's Old Fort Duquesne, or Captain Jack the Scout, is a stirring book that has filled the hearts of many boys who love a good tale. William Harvey Brown's story, On the South African Frontier, was written and published while he was curator in the Carnegie Museum. Pittsburgh has produced a group of standard school books, always of the very first importance in the literature of any country. Among these are the books by Andrew Burt and Milton B. Goff, and a series of readers by Lucius Osgood. Henry J. Ford's Rise and Growth of American Politics is a well-studied work. Henry A. Miller's Money and Bimetallism is a conscientious statement of his investigations of that question. Judge Marshall Brown has written 2 books, Bulls and Blunders and Wit and Humor of Famous Sayings. Mark M. Bennett's Steam Navy of the United States is a useful technical work. L. C. van Noppen, after pursuing his studies of Dutch literature in Holland, came to Pittsburgh and wrote a translation of Vondel's great Dutch classical poem Lucifer. Vondel published the original of his work some 10 or 15 years before Milton's Paradise Lost appeared, and critics have tried to show by the deadly parallel column that Milton drew the inspiration for some of his highest poetical flights from Vondel. It is probable, however, that Milton was unconscious of the existence of Vondel's work. S. L. Fleischmann has translated the poems of Heine with tenderness and feeling. Ella Boyce Kirk has written several educational pamphlets. Morgan Neville published a poem, Comparisons. From that Prince Rupert of the Astronomers, Professor James E. Keeler, who has made more than one fiery dash across the borderland of known science, we have Spectroscopic Observations of Nebulae. That truly gifted woman, Margaretta Wade Deland, was born in Pittsburgh in 1857 and resided here until her marriage in 1880. Among her books are John Ward, Preacher, The Story of a Child, Philip and His Wife, and Old Chester Tales. Jane Grey Swisshelm wrote the recollections of an eventful experience under the title Half a Century of Life. Nicholas Biddle composed a studious Life of Sebastian Cabot and another book, Modern Chivalry. Mrs. Annie Wade has written poems and stories. The city has fathered many able writers against slavery and intemperance, among whom was William H. Burleigh, who wrote Our Country. William B. Conway wrote Cottage on the Cliff. From Reverend John Black we have The Everlasting Kingdom, and Reverend John Tassie published A Life of Christ. William G. Johnston's interesting book, Experiences of a 49er, was published in 1892. John Reed Scott has published 2 successful novels, The Colonel of the Red Hussars and Beatrix of Clare. Martha Fry Boggs wrote A Romance of New Virginia. Then there are Polly and I, by Cora Thurmston, Free at Last and Emma's Triumph, by Mrs. Jane S. Collins, Her Brother Donard, by Emily E. Verder, Essays by Anna Pierpont Civiter, Human Progress by Thomas S. Blair, Steel, A Manual for Steel Users, a useful monograph by William Metcalf, and Memoir of John B. Gibson, by Colonel Thomas P. Roberts. Then there are some poor things from my own pen, if, in order to make the record complete, I may add them at the end. Oliver Cromwell, A History, 1894, John Marmaduke, A Romance of the English Invasion of Ireland in 1649, 1897, Beowulf, a Poem, 1901, Penruddock of the White Lambs, a novel, 1903, The Brayton Episode, a play, 1903, The Sword of the Parliament, a play, 1907, and this, A Short History of Pittsburgh, 1908. And such is the list. Imperfect though it may be, it is the best that I have been able to compose. But how large and full a measure of it all is! History, biography, philosophy, religion, nature, science, criticism, government, coinage and finance, Art, poetry, drama, travel, adventure, fiction, society, education, all avenues of human activity, all themes of human speculation, have been covered in books written with more or less interest and power by men and women of Pittsburgh. Much of this volume of production is ephemeral, but some of it, on the other hand, is undoubtedly a permanent addition to the world's literature. End of section 29. Section 30 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 30, Intellectual, Chapter 10. One word more before leaving this subject. Literature has not until recently enjoyed that degree of attention from the public press of Pittsburgh which it deserves. It ought to be the concern of every human unit in the nation to receive honest guidance in the development of literature, for literature, once again, is the written record of thought and action. Mobs will melt away when the units in the mob begin to think, and they will think when they read. Then will the law be paramount, and then will our institutions be safe. Thousands of our serious people annually subscribe for literary reviews of one kind or another, in order that they may follow the rapid expansion of the written record of the thought and action of the world, when the whole department might be covered so admirably by our daily newspapers. Should not the newspaper give each household practically all it needs in criticism and information outside of the printed books themselves? How easily we could spare some of the glaring and exaggerated headlines over the daily record of crime, misconduct, and false leadership, which inflame the mind and the passions with evil fire, and how joyfully we would welcome instead an intelligent, conscientious, comprehensive, discriminating, piquant, in short, a masterful discussion from day to day of the written record of the thought and action of the world as unfolded in its statesmanship, its oratory, its education, its heroism, and its literature. End of section 30. Section 31 of Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Section 31, Intellectual, Chapter 11. And so my little story of Pittsburgh comes to an end. It is the story of a great achievement in the building of a city, and the development of a community within its boundaries. I have sometimes heard a sneer at Pittsburgh as a place where undigested wealth is paramount. I have never beheld the city in that character. On the contrary, I have, on frequent occasions, seen the assemblage of men native here, where a goodly section of the brain and power of the nation was represented. There is much wealth here, but the dominant spirit of those who have it is not the spirit of pride and luxury and arrogance. There is much poverty here, but it is the poverty of hope which effort and opportunity will transform into affluence. And especially is there here a spirit of good fellowship, of help one to another, and of pride in the progress of the intellectual life. And with all of these comes a growth toward the best civic character, which in its aggregate expression is probably like unto the old prophet's idea of that righteousness which exalteth a nation. End of section 31. End of A Short History of Pittsburgh by Samuel Harden Church.